Okay, this is the Fall River Commission on Disability meeting for Thursday, November 14th.
No.
Yes, it is. 2019.
Let him do his job, Deb.
You know what I'd like to do before we, well, no, let's do this first. Let's start with the reading of the open meeting law statement. And
Wait, you want me to read it?
I could read it. Want me to read it?
Go ahead, Dennis.
Pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or video recording of this public meeting, or may transmit this meeting through any medium. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made, whether perceived or unperceived, by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permitted. Public input?
No, I mean, there are
Okay.
people in the audience, but they're not for any public input.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Roll call?
Chairman Dennis Pelosi,
That's you.
Vice
Oh,
Chairman,
I'm present.
Vice Chairman Debbie Pacheco,
Here.
Commissioner Robert Ray, Commissioner Sergeant Michael Thor,
Here.
Commissioner Kathy Ann Viveras, Commissioner Lisa Silva. Here. Attorney Gary Howiat.
Here.
Okay. The next item is approval of the minutes for the meeting of September, I believe it was 12th. Yep, September 12th. And these minutes were done very, very early, and I sent them, but I meant to resend them now because it's been at least a couple of months. So since I didn't resend them, I'm going to ask that we table them until next month. So I do hear an order, a motion to table.
Make a motion to table.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I'll second the motion.
Okay, those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Now, the next item, this is where I'd like to go around the room and have everybody identify themselves. But we're going to hear a presentation of the Fall River Transition Plan and Self-Assessment, which was done by the Institute for Human-Centered Design out of Boston, Massachusetts. Their staff are here today to present their final product of the transition plan and self-assessment. So I'm going to ask everybody go around the room to introduce. You've already heard from the commissioners, so we'll go around the room and so we get a sense of who's here. I don't know where we want to start. Do you want to start with IH?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is David West. Excuse me. I'm a accessibility specialist and a surveyor with the Institute for Human-Centered Design. And I'm here with my colleague Teresa McSorley, and I'll allow her to introduce herself.
Yeah, sure. Hello. My name is Teresa McSorley. I'm also from the Institute for Human-Centered Design. And we're really excited to be here to present our findings to you guys.
Excellent. All right.
Anybody else?
Nobody's in the audience. There's just Mr. Gallagher's in the audience with Tammy and
You can-
Nicola.
You know what? I'm going to ask, because I know that Chris Gallagher, and I know that Tammy Moltino, and I think there's city councilor too.
Leah, her too.
So I'm going to ask the rest of you to come up and join us at the table.
And Brandon.
And Brandon, I'm sorry, Brandon Golnick.
Where do we get more chairs?
You can stand for the presentation.
And the multitude of angels and saints.
There you go.
Are we here? Okay.
All right.
I'll turn it over to the Institute for Human-Centered Design, if I'm saying it right.
Yes, you are. It's a-
Bit of a mouthful.
I'm not sure why we settled on such a long name, but
I like adaptive environments.
uh-huh. That's absolutely right. That was the name of the organization 30 years ago or so. It's been IHCD for a while, as we say it, because it's a lot of syllables to say the whole thing. But again, my name's David West, and I'm here with Teresa McSorley. And we're now going through a PowerPoint. One of our senior project members, Anna Julian, unfortunately couldn't be here today, had an unanticipated illness. She asked me to remind everybody that when this video is posted in the public, it would be terrific if you could caption it. But now I'll begin with the PowerPoint and talk a little bit about the Institute for Human-Centered Design. As it says on the screen, which IHCD is a 40-year-old international educational nonprofit dedicated to enhancing the experience of people of all ages and abilities and cultures through excellence in design. Among the things that IHCD does, we have education and training on accessibility and universal, or what we sometimes now call inclusive design. We provide technical assistance, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. And we have consulting on accessibility, both physical spaces like the parks and buildings and so on that we look at here, and the digital environment. There's a web accessibility report that I know you've received, and I believe Anna also emailed some copies of it today to be sure everyone would have that. And we also have design services. One of the things we do for a lot of municipalities or individuals is we'll do plan review. We always like to help folks look at blueprints and so on before they put a shovel in the ground to see if we can spot things that either could be done a little bit better, or perhaps because of lack of expertise on the part of an architect, sometimes something can slip into a plan that really isn't accessible or compliant, and it's always best to find those things before you actually start work. It's better to fix things early than to have to come back and remediate things. And then a key part of the philosophy of Institute for Human-Centered Design is using people that we would call user experts. Apologize, I have a bit of a cold as well. We're all, I guess, not adapting too well to the start of winter here. But we believe that people with functional limitations have insight and knowledge to contribute to the planning and design process about what will work well for that individual and also other individuals with functional limitations. That is really key to informing doing things well, and it's stuff that folks who are maybe lucky enough not to have functional limitations might not ever think of. An example that comes to my mind that you may have read about recently, there's a beautiful new library that opened in the Bronx in New York. I think it was a $40 million or $45 million project. Actually the architecture writer in the New York Times gave it this glowing review, and after it opened, among other things, they discovered that the fiction section was only accessible by a flight of stairs, so it wasn't physically accessible. They have one elevator and it's always jammed, and in the children's section they don't have enough room for baby carriages. And if they had talked to members of the community that would have needed access to those things or used those elements, they probably could have avoided that in the design process. And that and many other things are things that user experts can help be sure that you do well. Two core beliefs of IHCD is that design powerfully and profoundly influences each of us in our sense of confidence, comfort, and control within either the built environment or out in parks or really anywhere. How things are designed are going to influence how you experience them. And it's particularly important at the edges of the spectrum. If it works there, if it works for people with functional limitations, and this is really what's meant by inclusive design, if you design things to work well for people who may have some limitations and you do it intuitively, it actually works well for all of us. It's a little bit of a boring example, but sometimes when people think of accessibility, really what they think of is curb cuts. And obviously curb cuts can be essential if you use a wheeled mobility device, but they also work pretty well if you're towing luggage or pushing a baby carriage. whatever the case may be. And there's lots of things within design that when it's done, perhaps with an eye towards a particular functional limitation or disability issue, it actually, as I said, works better for everyone. Another key activity at the Institute for Human-Centered Design is that we're home to the New England Americans with Disabilities Act Center. It's one of 10 regional ADA centers. Every part of the United States is served by an ADA center. We work in 6 New England states, but along with the other centers, everything is covered, including the territories and so on and so forth. And there's an 800 number on the screen, 800-949-4232. If someone calls that number, they should be routed to their local ADA center. And we have people available who will try to answer questions about all aspects of the ADA, as we'll be talking about here, whether it's Title I and employment issues, or Title II, your municipal responsibilities, or the other titles. I guess ultimately we may send you off to websites or send information, but really the key thing, I think, is that anyone who has a question about an ADA issue can reach a human being and try to get answers about what's a very complicated law. So the agenda of this PowerPoint is that we're going to have a brief overview of the ADA. We're going to talk about what it means to talk about an evaluation of policies, practices, and procedures. I'll talk a bit about the evaluation of facilities that we did here. And then Teresa and I will also do our best to answer any questions you may have. You can also stop me and ask questions if you'd like along the way, or wait to the end, whatever works best for you guys. 5 titles to the ADA. The ones I imagine you deal with here most prominently would include Title I, and that's employment law. There you come up upon things like reasonable accommodations for employees, and other things that under the law are intended to try to help people with disabilities be able to succeed in the workplace. The ADA overall, as I think I may be saying in a future slide, is at some level really about allowing or helping people with disabilities to be part of society. Access to transportation, access to employment, access to education, all of those things. Title II will be really the focus today. That's the responsibility of state and local governments. Title III deals with public accommodation, which essentially means businesses. Title IV focuses on telecommunications, and Title V has some elements, for example, requiring the setup of what's called the U.S. Access Board, which is a tremendous resource about accessibility, and provides an opportunity for comment and the development of additional guidance related to accessibility. Let's see. Title II, which is state and local governments of the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires that state and local government entities do not discriminate against people with disabilities in their programs, services, and activities. State and local governments may take steps to examine their programs and establish a plan for compliance with the law. That's part of what you've been doing in hiring us to work with you. A primary goal of the ADA is equal participation of individuals with disabilities in the mainstream, and that means that people with disabilities must be integrated in the programs and services that you provide to the greatest extent appropriate. Sometimes it can be allowed to have special programs for people with disabilities, but that's not something that can be done in a way that unnecessarily excludes people with disabilities from the programs and services that are being provided to the general public. Title II, this particular slide is just a list of some of the things that Title II applies to when thinking about the services and programs that a city or town provides. I'll just read a couple of them that would occur to you. I think town meeting, voting is very important. We looked at some senior centers. If you have a town-run camp, correctional facilities, you actually have to have accessible holding cells. It's a percentage, like a lot of things in the ADA. But all of these things that are emergency shelters, all of these things that could be programs of a city or town, there is an accessibility requirement. You have to, with the ADA, designate a responsible, if you have 50 or more employees, which you obviously do in Fall River, designate a responsible employee to be the ADA coordinator. You want to provide notice and of your ADA responsibilities and have those widely distributed, as you've done here in Fall River on your website, at prominent places in city offices and that kind of thing. I know you've also established a grievance procedure. Similarly, you want to be sure that city and town employees understand that procedure and can explain it to people, and that information about it is widely posted. Self-evaluation, which is what we've been helping you with. If I remember correctly, everyone was supposed to do it. Every city with more than 50 employees was supposed to do it within 2 years of the signing of the ADA. Many cities and towns didn't do that, which I suppose is a shame given how many years it's been since 1990 when it was signed, but I guess we would say better late than never, and we're always happy to see people getting pointed in the right direction.
And I think that's why that grant program went into effect as well, to help cities and towns be able to do that. So it's great that you guys were able to take advantage of that as well.
Yep, exactly right. And from what I understand, there's funding for several years continuing to help fund the self-evaluation, and then the transition plan, which we'll talk a bit about, which prioritizes things that need to be corrected and helps as a budgeting and planning tool going forward. And we like to think of it as a living document that as you check things off, you keep looking to getting through the full list eventually, and I suppose adding to it if you spot additional things that develop in the future. Program accessibility is a key concept to think about. You want to ensure that each program, service, or activity, when viewed in its entirety, is accessible to people with disabilities. New England, Fall River, where I live in Somerville, lots of different towns, we have lots of old buildings, including old municipal buildings. Program accessibility helps us think about the fact that you don't necessarily have to make every location in every building accessible, or every public park accessible, but you do need to make the programs and services provided accessible. So if, for example, you have a service that's provided in a building on, let's say, a third floor that doesn't have an elevator, if you make arrangements for people who have a physical disability to be able to meet on the first floor of that building or at some other location that's accessible, and you publicize it, and it really is available at at consistent hours and times when people need it, then a service can be provided that way without having to address the physical accessibility of every single building. That also applies to things like parks. It's not required to immediately have every single park in a municipality be accessible, but you do want the representative set of programs and activities at a park to be accessible and to those be distributed. So if you have, let's say, 25 parks in the city, maybe you could pick 8 of them that are geographically distributed, and between them have represent pretty much all your programs and services. And by making those accessible, making it so people can get to them and get to the amenities at the park, you achieve a program accessibility. And that's really the focus of where the ADA begins when it thinks of all the services that are provided by a city or town. Effective communication is another very important concept with the ADA. It's why, hopefully, for example, the presentation we provided will work with a screen reader, and it's why I mentioned that we hope that you'll caption the video of this meeting eventually. You want communication with people who have disabilities to be as effective as communication for people that don't have disabilities. It also means providing auxiliary aids and services when necessary. And as I think we'll probably talk about, for example, that could mean having an assistive listening system available for a facility like this where the public might meet, or if it's, let's say, a police station or something like that, where you might encounter a person who's arrested or dealing with the police station for whatever reason, who might need video or other kinds of translation services, it's important to have a plan to be able to try to provide that in a timely and effective manner, and to, when possible, listen to the input of people with disabilities about what method of communication is going to work best for them. It can also be simpler things like having materials available in large print, alternate languages, that kind of thing. And when thinking about effective communication, you think about the nature, length, and complexity of the exchange of information, the context, and the person's normal method of communication. And that's where I was hinting at, you, when possible, you want to ask the person who needs an auxiliary aid or service what works best for them. Also to help yourselves for things that where you know that it's possible that someone might request an auxiliary aid or service, say town meeting. It can make sense to publish a town policy asking people, if possible, to make their requests for accommodation, let's say 2 weeks in advance, even if they show up the day before or the day of the meeting or right at the meeting. You should always do what you can to try to accommodate them. But we know from events that we do at IHCD, it can take time to schedule a sign language interpreter or to get someone there who's going to do CART, where there's basically captioning of the event as it continues. And so publicizing a policy requesting that people give you a little bit of warning can work well, both for the person who's more likely to get the method of effective communication that they want, and for the city or town, because you have some time to plan. Let's see. This slide is just explaining that auxiliary aids and services enable persons with impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills to have an equal opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits of programs and activities conducted by the city. And again, under Title II, that's the basic entire thrust of Title II of the ADA, is helping people with the full range of functional limitations to participate fully in city and town services. A big part of that is web accessibility. I know that we've prepared a web accessibility report for the town of Fall River, looking at your website. It really is important to the greatest extent possible to make websites work for people who use screen readers. It also applies in other titles of the ADA. You may be aware that our Attorney General had a big lawsuit with Monster, the job site, to get them to make their website accessible. And if you think about it, you'd really want that to happen, so that folks with disabilities have the same opportunity to find out about jobs they could apply for and succeed at. But as a city or town, obviously, I'm sure you all know that the web is where a lot of people go for information. So doing what you can to meet those guidelines is very important. Our scope of work, in terms of what we did here in Fall River, we tried to evaluate your programs, services, and activities. We looked at certain facilities. I think we have a slide here that says literally the number of them that we looked at, and preparing this ADA self-evaluation with data about the current state of compliance, and also gaps in the services you're providing, with an eye towards obviously over time you're being able to correct them. So evaluation of programs, services, and activities. One of the elements we produce for you, we call a report or a narrative, which summarizes our findings regarding Title II compliance. That was developed in part based on an ADA questionnaire that was sent out to most of the city and town departments, 7 of which responded in detail. We also had some phone interviews, and of course have welcomed the input of the Disability Commission, and as I've mentioned a couple times, also we've looked in detail at your website. Let's see, so these slides, maybe I'll go through kind of quickly. As I already mentioned, the city has met its responsibility in designating an ADA coordinator. That's really an essential step, and in publicizing that person and letting people in the town know how to get in touch with the ADA coordinator, because that's, for a lot of folks, the gateway to how they're going to request services or accommodations that they may need. And as I mentioned before, you have established and published on your website your grievance procedure, which is an important step. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Good.
I think the only thing we wanted to mention here about the grievance procedure, I think it was a little unclear to some of the staff as to whether or not it was available. So just making sure that it is known and especially distributed to department heads to make sure that everyone is aware that they have one and where to go if they need to fill one out is really important. So.
Oh, and I should add, Teresa did a decent amount of the direct surveying and honestly is more knowledgeable about a lot of the specific issues that we encountered in Fall River than I am. I'm, as I said, unfortunately filling in for Anna, who's also really more familiar with things. So, yeah, I appreciate Teresa at any point chiming in and saying you're likely to know something I'm missing. Let's see, yeah, you've also published notice on your website, and we didn't see any evidence that the city has failed to address a request for a reasonable modification of your programs, policies, and procedures. Obviously, as with all of these things, the procedure for doing it, the forms that are required, we want to be sure that those are widely publicized, put in prominent locations in public buildings and on the website and that kind of thing. We also didn't see any evidence that with city and town employees that you failed to provide a reasonable accommodation for employees that requested them. As I'm sure you know, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the whole point of a reasonable accommodation in the employment context is something that's not an undue financial or administrative burden that allows where the city helps an individual employee to be able to succeed at their job. It could be as simple as someone like myself who doesn't have the greatest vision, maybe requesting a larger monitor, an individual who's a wheeled mobility device user requesting that they have a desk that has sufficient knee clearance so they can get to their desk. It's not often accommodations that make a huge difference, not always, but often they're actually very simple things. And it's important that you make clear to employees that you're open to those requests, and that when possible you grant them in a way that's effective. So, as I said, so that an employee can succeed at their job. Now talk a bit about the evaluation of the facilities we actually saw here in Fall River. And anytime you want to chime in here, please feel free.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, we surveyed 19 municipal buildings. So we looked at 6 fire stations and your 4 senior centers. I think Anna had told me that one of those has closed recently.
Yeah,
The Flint stick.
The Flint one? Gotcha. And then, so we also looked at 25 outdoor areas, so parks and stuff like that, and then 21 polling locations. So, and basically what we based it off of was the 2010 standards, so the 2010 ADA standards, and also the MAAB standards, so that's the Massachusetts specific standards. And we basically looked at whatever, so if we were looking at an issue, we went with the standard that basically gave more accessibility. So for a very simple example, in the ADA, routes are only required to be 36 inches wide, but if we noticed that they were very, very narrow, we would recommend that they be 48 inches wide, just to give people a little bit more room to get around. There's also bigger wheelchairs and mobility devices coming out now, so it's better to have more room than less. So can you talk about this just for a second?
Sure. So we have, as I was talking about a little bit, our narrative report, and I think we're going to have pictures of these coming up in the slides. The report is in narrative sentence format, highlighting highlighting issues that we saw at whatever location we were surveying. With each report, there's what we call a catalog that has a photograph of each identified issue, a suggested remedy, and in some cases, I don't actually recall the extent we did this with Fall River, but did we do costing?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, then in pretty much every case then.
Oh, yes.
There's a cost, an estimated cost to remedy the issue. We base that on something called RS Means, which is a database that's been developed to gauge costs for typical tasks, such as repairing something on a sidewalk or a curb ramp, or putting in an additional water fountain, or whatever the case may be. We've heard a lot about the pricing estimates. Some folks tell us they're too high because with municipal staff, the actual costs aren't what we're suggesting. Sometimes we hear they're too low. From what I understand, some of the president's tariffs are starting to affect concrete prices. And so, we're going from a database that wasn't necessarily updated this month. And we don't include design costs in our estimates. So it's really it's a ballpark that's hope that can be a guide for planning. But your actual costs will almost certainly differ depending on the element.
Costs may vary.
So the slide that Teresa's just put up shows the cover of one of our drafts, and it's showing the narrative. Basically, at the beginning, we describe the building, approach and entrance, and that kind of thing. And then we call out in the narrative the key accessibility issues, and then more in what I think will be the next slide in the catalog is where we have specific photos indicating those and highlight the costs. So,
Yeah.
Right, and so this next slide is showing what we call the catalog. It's delivered in a single accessible PDF along with that narrative report. I don't know, you can't really see it on the screen truthfully, but each of these photos that's being projected is a photograph of an individual issue that we highlighted. And then there's a column that describes what needs to be done to correct it, and a column that has a price estimate.
Okay.
And then we have the transition plan, or what's the basis of the transition plan, a spreadsheet that has tabs. Usually things are organized by categories like municipal buildings, parks and outdoor spaces, that kind of thing. They're broken apart, but it has all the information from the catalog that I was just describing, except for the photos themselves. However, the ID numbers do link up. So in other words, if you're looking at the this cost estimate spreadsheet for this building and you're looking at ID 18, it will be ID 18 in the report that has the photo. You can match them with each other. And then we take a stab at prioritizing what order we think you might want to approach things that need to be corrected, including things that are either very important or high priority, and also things that are very easy and maybe inexpensive. We want to call attention to those as well. But part of the reason we delivered as an Excel spreadsheet is obviously you have your own budgeting and capital planning process, and this way you can sort the spreadsheet as you'd like, or change the priority a bit depending on how things will work out best for Fall River.
Yeah.
Let's see, so this slide is again talking about the program accessibility obligation. I don't think it's adding too much to what I've already said, but thinking about dispersion of activities, having them in each part of town, and just being sure that all your programs and services are provided in an accessible way, in an accessible location. Even, again, if that doesn't necessarily mean that every single building and every part of every building and every park has to be accessible.
All right, so we're just going to go through some of the big issues that we saw, or repeating issues that we saw in municipal buildings. So overall, obviously, access into a building is going to be, the highest priority. If you can't get into a place to experience the programs that they have there, it's going to be a pretty large issue. I'm going to read down and then to the left. So next, we do want to make sure that there's an adequate number of accessible parking spaces, and they are located in close proximity to the nearest accessible entrance. Oftentimes, we saw designation signage for rooms that didn't necessarily have raised characters in Braille. Those are very important for people that are blind or low vision. And also having them on the latch side is typically how people can be taught to find those signs. So you find the latch on the door, and then you search up from there on that wall. So that's why we like to have it on that latch side of the door. Also, egress signage should be clearly labeled, obviously with illuminated exit signs. And when they are accessible, we want to make sure that those illuminated exit signs do have the international symbol of accessibility, so the little guy in the wheelchair. And those also should have tactile signs indicating them as exits in case someone is visually impaired. We want to make sure that service counters have lowered sections or are completely low to 36 inches maximum, so that if someone is of shorter stature or is using a mobility device, they're not peering up over a counter at someone, that kind of thing. Work surfaces, as David mentioned earlier, we want to make sure they have proper knee clearance, so if someone is using a mobility device, they can roll underneath it and work just like all the rest of us do. Toilet rooms, we obviously want to make sure those are accessible because everyone has to pee. And by accessible, we mean we want to make sure that has a proper turning radius inside. We want to make sure there's grab bars, and we want to make sure that the flush controls are on the open or transfer side of the toilet. So in this one, I think in this picture it's over on this left side, and it should be over here. And then with drinking fountains, we often saw that there would maybe just be one, and every time that there is a drinking fountain for a seated user, there needs to be one for a standing user, and vice versa. Another thing that happens quite often with drinking fountains is that they become protruding objects. So anything that is higher than 27 inches and protrudes more than 4 inches out, or is lower than 80 inches and protrudes more than 4 inches out, those end up being protruding objects. So someone that is blind or low vision might not necessarily be able to detect it with a cane, or would be at a height where they would just hit it with their head. And so drinking fountains, the ones that we've seen across the board, sometimes they do tend to not have that lower area so that people can know that they're there. And then so this building specifically, Government Center, we saw similar issues. So I'm going to do the same order I did before. We want to make sure that all your egress doors have the proper signage with tactile, and then if they're accessible, make sure that they have an illuminated ISA. We want to make sure, again, that all of our signage for rooms and different areas have that tactile, or that raised characters in Braille. And then I think this is one of your meeting rooms, if I'm not mistaken, these blue chaired images. We want to make sure that there's an accessible route to not only accessible seating, but also to that front podium so that people can participate equally. And again, with service counters, we want to make sure that we have lowered sections. This is actually a fairly decent example of a drinking fountain because it's set into the wall, so it's not necessarily acting as a protruding object, but it does not have the drinking fountain for a standing user. And I think the TVs were also pretty prevalent, or other things that acted as protruding objects. We don't like whacking our heads, neither does anyone else. And then another issue is with stairwells. Those can also be protruding objects, so we want to make sure that they have basically a cane detectable barrier underneath them until it gets more than 80 inches high. Then it's out of that kind of range.
And just to add, I've seen people do things. You can put a rail there that a cane would detect, but I've also seen people just put potted plants, a couch,
chairs, yeah.
Things like that. Just something that the cane is going to discover before an individual would strike their head on the part of the staircase that's ascending.
And again, so with toilet rooms, urinals have a certain height requirement that need to be of an accessible height. We want to make sure that lavatories or sinks, that they have covered or insulated pipes underneath, because if it gets really hot, and if someone has rolled up underneath to use it, that can burn their knees or legs. We also want to make sure that controls with not only the faucet controls, but even with door handles and stuff, we want to make sure that they don't require twisting of the wrist or tight grasping, because someone that has limited mobility of their hand might not be able to operate it. And again, making sure that there's proper turning radius, and also that things are within reach range. So I'm pretty sure this trash dispenser is a bit too high, and kind of there's no clear floor space. There's no easy way to get to it, so you'd have to be reaching all the way over the toilet to get to it. We did also look at the police station. Tammy, you were there that day. What a day.
It was a big day.
We want to make sure that the parking spaces are of compliant size and have proper signage. And also we want to make sure that the access aisles connect to an accessible route, because otherwise you can get out and hang out in the parking lot, but can't really go much else.
I just want to say something that the sign's really important. A lot of people will paint the accessible symbol in a space, which you're allowed to do. In fact, there really aren't any requirements about that at all. You could use different colors and that kind of thing. But we get snow here, so if you don't have the sign, once snow falls or leaves or that kind of thing, you can have a situation where you have really perfect accessible parking, the proper access aisle, enough space and that kind of thing, and nobody knows it's there.
Yeah.
So the identification and the designation for the van space, that signage information can be really important for people who need to find that space.
Yeah, and just as a side note, in terms of van accessible spaces, it's ideal when it can be, so as you're pulling in the van accessible space here, and then the access aisle on this side, so that if someone is using a van, they can get out on that passenger side. They can put out a ramp or whatever else they use to get out. Again, we want to make sure signage is correct in that location as well. We want to make sure mats are secured down, either taped down or otherwise, to make sure it's not a tripping hazard. And David also mentioned generally just to make sure that we have assistive listening devices, so that people can equally participate in meetings and stuff like that. There are holding cells in this police station, so and there is one of those. I don't know actually what it's called, but it's a communication center between someone that's being held and either their lawyer or someone else that's coming to visit. We want to make sure that there's clear floor space on either side, so that both participants can equally get up to that area, and making sure that the telephones are within reach range. Similar issues with the toilets, and specifically just to talk about the urinal for a second. If it is recessed into a thing that's into an area that's more than 24 inches deep, it needs to have at least that 36 inches clear space, so that someone could get up to it. We also want to make sure that we have compliant toilet rooms within the holding cells, and that's only a percentage. It's not like it has to be everyone. So I believe that there are men's, women's, and juvenile cells at the police station, so one of each at least has to have grab bars, clear floor space at the sink, etc. And again, so it's a good example of a drinking fountain not being a protruding object, but not a great example of it having a higher one as well. We also went to many fire departments, and one of the main reasons we want to make sure that these are accessible is because we were told that many of them do offer tour groups for students, so we want to make sure that those are accessible to all of our students as well. So having accessible counter heights, having an accessible toilet room, making sure that the pipes underneath sinks are covered. We also want to make sure, and again, with the flush controls being on the open side, and all that stuff. Another very common issue across these kinds of reviews that we do is when you have toilet paper dispenser or paper towel dispensers. Those can also, they're big bulky objects, but so those are often hung at more than 27 inches high, so those are often protruding objects as well. A really quick fix is to be able to put it into a corner so that it's not necessarily in the circulation path. That seems to be right on the route to the stalls, or just getting a lower profile one. Or one other example is to have a permanent trash can underneath, whether it's bolted to the wall or otherwise, so that is kind of your detectable, your cane detectable barrier underneath it. Okay, and then we also looked at our senior center, your senior centers, and so making sure that there's an accessible route into them is obviously the most important, especially with our seniors, as disability and age tend to come hand in hand. At some point in our lives, all of us might experience some sort of disability, but especially as we get older. We also want to make sure, again, that we have signs on the latch side of the door, and we want to make sure that in an accessible toilet room, the sign does have the international symbol of accessibility as well. If it's on a door, and if it's, say this were the push side of the door, if someone was trying to find that sign and they found it on the door and someone comes out, they're going to get bonked in the head, which also isn't ideal. I want to make sure we have tables with proper knee clearance. And so with this bottom middle picture, we've got a door with a doorknob. Our sign doesn't have raised characters or braille, and I'm not sure if there was turning space in this one, if I'm remembering it correctly.
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah. And so this is that really classic example of a drinking fountain just protruding right out there, just hanging out. And again, uninsulated pipes are some common issues we saw there. So kind of just to summarize, we want to make sure that there is an accessible route from all points of arrival to those areas in the building where the programs and services are provided, that we have a proper number of required accessible parking spaces. I think it's for every 25 you need another accessible space, and then for every 6 of those accessible spaces you need a van accessible space. And then again, we want to make sure accessible toilet rooms are provided for everyone. And so where it might be technically infeasible to provide a multi-user toilet room, to just have one all-gender single neutral toilet room. One all-gender single-user toilet room. So that it's in the same area, and so that it's accessible for everyone to use. And again, so we want to make sure that they have a sufficient number of accessible features where these programs are being held. So counters, work surfaces, and whatnot. All right, we also did a lot of surveying in outdoor areas. Some better than others, obviously. We want to make sure there's a proper number of accessible spaces. It's also a great thing when the actual, even if they're not just the accessible spaces, but if all the spaces are clearly marked, so that people know how many spaces or how many cars can fit in that area and whatnot. At baseball fields and soccer fields and otherwise, we want to make sure that there's an accessible route to the team seating, and we also want to make sure that there is a compliant pull-up space next to those benches to make sure that people that might be using a mobility device can also roll up next to their teammates and hang out with them just like anyone else would. And it's also ideal when it's basically from the back of the bench an extra 12 inches back so that there can be shoulder alignment so that we can sit like this instead of me having to sit up here if I were sitting next to David. This is a pretty good example of an accessible picnic table. We just want to make sure that it connects to an accessible route. Also at fan seating, so at bleachers, if there's parents or otherwise, we also want to make sure that there's an accessible space for them to sit and watch the game. There were many areas that did have comfort stations, so toilet rooms. We want to make sure there's proper signage there. Even though it's outside, we still want to have raised characters in Braille in the ISA. We want to make sure dispensers are at an accessible height. And again, we want to have compliant toilet rooms, so the grab bars should be continuous all the way across from one end to the other. And there shouldn't ideally be anything on top of the grab bars. So like, for instance, with this toilet paper roll, it's kind of hanging on top, it's kind of in the way. And then we also want to make sure we have accessible portable toilets where they are provided.
I would actually add something that Teresa brought up earlier when she was talking about the 2 laws that we looked to, 521 CMR, or the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, or the 2010 ADA standards. The Massachusetts state law doesn't, if there were, in this picture where we see the grab bars in the accessible compartment, toilet compartment, Massachusetts does not allow a toilet paper dispenser to be above the grab bar. ADA actually does. It's been determined that having the dispenser lower as opposed to being above the grab bar is what constitutes greater accessibility. So if we were in Massachusetts and there were, in this photo, there were a dispenser above this grab bar, we would tell you to move it down if we were surveying in Connecticut, New Hampshire, some of the other states where we work, we wouldn't call that out, but that's because of the specifics. It's an example of specific state requirement, or as Teresa was explaining before, Massachusetts requires ramps be wider than the ADA requires, and we also require that sidewalks be wider than the ADA requires. So there are a lot of things like that in these these outdoor spaces that we call out, focusing on the specific Massachusetts law.
Yeah, thanks. And then we also want to make sure that there is an accessible route to all of the elements. So David's talked about this quite a bit, but to picnic tables, to the edge of playing areas, so it doesn't have to be. I mean, with the basketball court, it should be a level surface. But say with the soccer field, it doesn't necessarily have to connect, obviously, all the way through a soccer field. You just have to get to the edge of it to be able to start play. We want to make sure that drinking fountains are connected to an accessible route, and that there are drinking fountains for standing and seated users. Again, with playgrounds, we want an accessible route to the playground, we want an accessible route around the playground, and then to individual play elements within the playground. And so this is something that has been discussed a lot in our office, is that wood chips are not, or engineered wood fiber, is that what it's
Exactly.
technically called? So that is still, actually, can you explain
Sure.
this? I'm gonna get it wrong.
So within the playground, to get to each of the elements inside the playground, you need to have an accessible route to it. We recommend a 60-inch wide accessible route, and an accessible route has to be stable, firm, and slip resistant. There are also other laws in the state where you want that surface to be impact attenuating. So if a kid falls off monkey bars or something, they're less likely to injure themselves. Engineered wood fiber, which is what a lot of municipalities have used historically in wood chips in playgrounds, can be within the playground, but it can't be part of that accessible route. Basically, the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, in a case with a school in North Attleboro, I think, determined that the wood chips aren't firm and stable, firm, stable, and slip resistant, and are rarely maintained sufficiently because the movement of people through the playground is going to disperse the wood chips. So they can't be part of the accessible route to the play elements in the playground. And then Teresa was talking about the other two things we look at with playgrounds is the accessible route from, let's say, the parking area to the playground itself. That could be things like stone dust paths, concrete, asphalt, whatever the case may be, and that also can be permitted for the route around the playground.
Yeah.
But anyway, what we usually recommend is what's called poured-in-place rubber for the accessible route in the playground. It is unfortunately quite expensive. However, once installed, there's very little maintenance that's required with it. It should last for quite a long time. We actually spoke recently to some of the people at the MAAB, and if you go onto the Architectural Access Board website, pretty prominently displayed, there is a place where towns can submit other materials for evaluation. Let's say they don't want to use poured-in-place rubber, they have some other material that they think will work as the accessible route in the playground. And a couple towns have. Newton has submitted something that we understand. It's basically a 2-year evaluation process. They have to see how the material weathers in New England. But we understand that Newton is likely close to approval with some type of rubberized surface that we anticipate, if it's approved, will be less expensive than poured-in-place rubber. It's not a definitive ruling. I suppose it's a little bit like a drug trial. It can kind of fail at any point. But you might, if you're thinking, once you've achieved the program accessibility that we talked about, a representative number of the playgrounds are accessible, and maybe you're thinking about trying to get to all of them eventually, you might want to get in touch with Ginny Farley, who's the ADA coordinator in Newton, or call the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board. You can find their phone number on the web, and ask if there are any new materials that have been approved that could allow for a cost savings. Because apparently the MAAB, and certainly we, when we cost estimate it, we are sensitive to how expensive that poured-in-place rubber can be.
Yeah, thanks. And And again, like benches and covered stations and otherwise, we want to make sure there's an accessible route to them. And so again, this is just where I guess I was going to talk about it here. I got a little bit ahead of myself. But yes, we just want to make sure that there is an accessible route to these play elements within the playground.
Right. Actually, before you go, the center one is something that we see a lot, particularly when people are using engineered wood fiber, although my eyes aren't that good. I can't tell if that's what's being done there. But there'll be a border around the entire playground. And that's going to mean that some people with wheeled mobility devices and other physical disabilities can't get into the playground. Now, it doesn't mean you have to rip out the whole border, but you need an accessible route to a 36-inch wide entrance somewhere there, so that whether it's the child or maybe the parent or grandparent of the child, they can get in. And that it's a common mistake that we see that I don't think it's malicious in any way. The people who are designing it, I think, are just trying to be sure that the wood chips don't go everywhere. But when that's done, there's really no way for a number of people to get into the play area.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So again, just to kind of go over what we just talked about, making sure that there is an accessible route to all elements in the park, and ensuring that they're provided. An accessible route is provided around the playground and to these individual play components. So yeah. And also, obviously, when there are toilet rooms provided, making sure that an accessible toilet stall or individual single-user room is provided, and making sure we have wheelchair spaces at bleachers, whether that be team seating or fan seating, making sure that we have compliant designation signage, and that. So basically, it's a certain number of these amenities within the park have to be accessible. So say you have 3 picnic tables in a park, not every single one of them has to be accessible and connected to an accessible route, but at least one of them does. And there is a certain percentage, if you get into larger numbers, that you can find within the ADA. So 5%. 5%.
But 5%, but what Teresa just said, at least one. So if you have
Right.
3, you can't go 5%. Okay, I can put 25% of my picnic table is accessible or something.
Yeah. And then so these are just some good examples that we saw when we were out. So Britland Park, this is their soccer field. It looked like it was pretty recently renovated. They have really nice integrated fan seating that has accessible spaces, and that also have companion seating next to them. So if you come with someone, so say I was coming with someone that used a mobility device, I'd be able to sit with them right next to them, which is great. And also Kennedy Park, they do at least have space next to their team seating. I don't believe it was connected to an accessible route, but it is at least nice that they have extra room there, and it's covered, so.
Yeah, and I'd add one more thing. I'm sorry, I don't want to keep people here too long, but a common mistake that I think people are trying to do the right thing, but they just haven't thought it through enough. I've seen actually some very fancy baseball stadiums where they do the math, they know the total number of seats, and they determine we need, whatever it is, 15 accessible seating spaces, and so they just clear out a whole area where there'd be room for, say, 15 wheelchairs. I think maybe assuming that people in wheelchairs only know other people in wheelchairs or something like that, and you really do need to think about that companion seating, because obviously people who use wheel mobility devices sometimes come in groups, but they have friends who want traditional seating as well. And like I said, I've seen some really nice ballparks that made or sport facilities that made a really serious effort about it and screwed that part of it up. And one other thing I wanted to say about getting to the edge of sport activity, that's both for the individual who would participate or for someone who's going to be watching an event. And an example of that where you might not have thought about it would be with skateboard parks. Obviously, the skateboard park itself is not going to be accessible. It's a series of hills and ramps and things that are, so people can fling themselves into the air with their skateboards. But you want an accessible route to the edge of it so that perhaps the sibling or grandparent or whatever it is of the kid in that park who's using that park can get there and enjoy the space with their kid. And it's that kind of thing that they're often thinking about when they say, let's get to the edge of sport activity. Even if we're not addressing the accessibility at the amenity itself.
Yeah. And also there are obviously counters within the city of Fall River that do have lowered sections, which is great. And so also we did look at I believe it was 21 voting facilities. So I think, do you want to hop back in?
Yeah, so the recommendations, most of the recommendations that we met, and often it's really going to relate to parking and some other elements as well. We suggested permanent remedies. So in other words, when it seemed appropriate, we just suggest you provide proper accessible parking near the polling place. However, it's certainly allowed within the ADA to do these things in a temporary way, to mark off the spaces with a temporary sign and maybe cones or something like that. You're not required to provide parking, but we always recommend, at least if there is somewhere to pull over near the polling place, that at minimum you try to create at least one temporary van accessible parking space on what would be the closest accessible route to the accessible entrance. So that the key point of this sign is, when we thought it made sense, we suggested a permanent remedy, but that's not what's absolutely required. What's required is that when you're providing parking, that there is accessible parking on the day of the poll. And then within the voting facilities, the first element that's mentioned here is you want doors that are at least 32 inches clear. That's what's considered an accessible door in any context. And so you need to have at least the accessible entrance and an accessible exit, have a door that's that width. And you want a 36-inch path of travel through the voting facility, particularly up to the most polling places will have at least one accessible voting machine. You want to be sure you have clear space at that voting machine. You want to be sure that people in the polling place know how the accessible voting machine works, so they can assist someone if they need it with the machine, although the whole philosophy of the machine is to allow people to vote independently. And you want to be sure they're set up. We once went to a town where they asked us to look at their voting facilities on a day when an election was taking place, and we went to more than one location where they had a lovely accessible voting machine that was still in its suitcase. Nobody had set it up. And again, I always look at those things and I realize people are busy, and they probably brought it over 3 days beforehand and thought someone else was going to do it. It's not, I don't mean to suggest, again, this is always malicious, but some level of attentiveness is key. Particularly when you have an accessible feature, you want to be sure it's available for people to use it.
Right.
Honestly, I don't think there's anything new on this slide. This is basically talking about the goals of the evaluation and transition plan beyond what I've said. That's the spreadsheet that presents the stuff that's in the catalog with the photos and the remedies, the photos, the issues, the remedies, and the costs. Except to stress that, again, we really hope you don't just sort of take what we deliver to you and put it in a drawer somewhere. The participation of the Disability Commission, I'm sure, will help you to keep your eye on the ball. But to keep going back to that list of items and check off as many as you can over time as budgeting and resources permit. And I guess we've made it. I know we've been talking a lot. Is there anything that you'd like to ask about? Maybe some more detail or something specific in the town? You can also email us. I know I passed out lots of cards. If something occurs to you later, you can certainly send us a message.
Did you have something else to comment to?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Right, all these packages, right? There's solutions to every problem that the city has? Is that what this is?
There's solutions to the issues that we saw in the places we evaluated. I don't think we evaluated every municipal building in Fall River or every single park, but we.
I think
but,
we did, actually.
Oh, did we? Oh, okay. We don't always. But
Overachievers.
but every.
And the voting locations that you surveyed were on an active voting day
Oh,
as
okay.
well.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Nice.
So,
Yeah, we had 3 teams out that day to make sure we captured all of them. on a-
but every issue that we saw at a location that we went to is listed there.
In terms of accessibility.
Now, I see some of these got prices to them. Is that to fix them?
Exactly. It's as I was saying a little bit before, it's an informed estimate of what it's going to cost to do something. For a variety of reasons, prices end up varying significantly, municipality to municipality, depending on the resources that they have. If they have staff on salary that can already provide some of the labor, or whether they have to hire somebody, that kind of thing. But this is our estimate based on a independent resource, this data source called RS Means, at what a typical cost might be.
And this would be for would have to spend all the money.
We would try to secure grants, of course.
Right.
So
All
that,
these.
so if I'm not mistaken, that's
Whatever
what
we
you
can.
did to get us to end up working on this transition plan in the first
Right.
place, I believe. And then so the next step would be to get another grant from the same group to be able to start to implement. such
And you can
To the
actually,
grant writer,
Yes, sir.
you're gonna be tired after this?
Absolutely not.
He's already on it, Leo.
you can actually,
Yeah, yeah.
the
Yeah.
part of the point of these reports and transition plan is to arm you with the data you need to seek funding, so that there can be a way to cover these expenses. And then the other thing to think about is, this, hopefully, the reports will inform you on the kinds of issues that we typically saw, and that can be in the back of your mind if you do anything new, so that hopefully you don't repeat mistakes or anything that you start from scratch or that you repair is up to current standards.
And we can apply for a lot of these projects too.
I'll have
And
to separate.
we can apply for a lot of these projects in bulk. Like we can combine projects and submit to the Massachusetts Self-Signed Disability. But we can also leverage things like mass trails for the open recreation access routes.
Right.
I know that over in Pembroke, I'm the ADA coordinator there. We use CPC to match our funds.
Right.
So I don't think the burden, this is a really good document to leverage state funding and federal funding for these projects.
Right. And I don't know as much about this in detail, but my general understanding is it also provides you an element of legal protection. If you did absolutely nothing, perhaps it wouldn't be so much protection, but the fact that you've taken this step to identify issues and to begin thinking about how to remedy them helps protect you from nothing's 100% guaranteed, but it helps protect you from the Department of Justice showing up and mandating how you fix things, and not, in those cases, really not having much room for your input or your budgeting priorities. So along with being something that was required of the municipality, it's also, as I said, something that has you in a safer position than you would be if you didn't do this at all, because there's a program called Project Civic Access where DOJ occasionally just picks a city or town and decides that they haven't done what they should do. And as I said, there's not much flexibility when they come in and tell you when to do it, how quickly to do it, what to spend on it. This way, at least you can gain some leverage of control and ability to exert your own priorities as you think about remedying things.
Awesome. Thank you.
How do you feel that the city is doing? Are we behind other communities? Have we got a long way to go?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it definitely is going to vary. We've been doing these projects for how long now?
You mean IHCD?
Yeah, working on
Well,
these.
I mean, they've certainly been doing surveys since the 88 came out in 1990. I mean, they've been
Right. Yeah,
doing
and
this
so
forever.
This isn't the only city that we surveyed this year as well. So there's certainly other towns and cities that are looking to upgrade their facilities, and some towns are going to be better at some things than others. So it really does all depend. I think one of the biggest things well, one, it's great that you guys do have grievance procedures and information about that on your website, because that is one of the first places people can go to get that information. So even if they can't necessarily get into every building, they can at least get information on what is and is not currently accessible. So.
And also remember, as we've said a few times, you're thinking about program access, which is making the programs, when looked at in their entirety, accessible. Sometimes little knowledge is dangerous. I have a friend whose father is a medical doctor, and he told me when they first started doing advertising for medications, that often the language that was used in the advertisements was would say, "Tell your doctor you want X," and people would come in with no medical training and start insisting that this guy prescribed various things, which probably wasn't medically wise. Similarly, well-meaning and concerned people with sort of a partial understanding of the law might come to you and say, not every single location in this city is fully accessible. And well, honestly, that's not your obligation, right? Your obligation is to focus on, on making the program accessible, in a variety of ways. And that's a way that you can both push back within, the constraints of budget reality, but also be focusing on actually meeting the needs of people with disabilities. It's really key that you get to make choices with an eye towards making the program, activity, or service accessible.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No?
Well, as we mentioned a couple times, you have our cards. Also, these also what we've sent you, as far as I know, we're still at the draft point. I maybe should have said this earlier. You know your your facilities better than we do.
Yep.
We wouldn't have done this intentionally, but certainly there could be something that we kind of viewed incorrectly, or absolutely could be something that you know of that you wish we'd seen that we didn't, or whatever the case may be. It's more important to us to get it right than just to say we did it. So if there are things you see that you think we should correct in the narratives or the catalogs or anywhere, please let us know, and we'll certainly make those edits as is necessary.
Tammy, is that where you and Chris would come in then and looking at this if there was something that was either missed or represented incorrectly, that as part of the department that you guys are in for buildings, is that way you guys would come in and look at this and say, hey, this really doesn't make sense, or looks like you might have missed this and we're concerned about that, so like.
Yeah, we would do that, which we've already reviewed the packet.
Okay.
And we moved it along to the commission for review as well.
I saw that. I haven't. We have to go through it.
So if anyone sees anything, we would address that prior to placing it on file with the state.
Perfect. Okay.
Which we hope to do, very soon.
Okay.
So just looking to wrap this up so we can get this on file, because we do need it on file to apply for the second piece of the grant.
Okay.
So when we started this, we had applied for the Massachusetts Office on Disabilities Municipal and ADA Improvement Grant. It's a two-part grant. Because there were so many municipalities that hadn't completed their self-evaluation and transition plans, they broke the grant into two pieces.
Okay.
One is the planning grant, and the other is the project grant.
Okay.
In order to qualify for the project grant, you have to have your self-evaluation and transition plan on file with MOD. That's where the planning grant comes in. They offered the planning grant to help municipalities get this achieved. This was huge for Fall River.
Okay.
Because the larger you are, of course, the more involved it gets. Your smaller municipalities usually would have an ADA coordinator on hand full-time, that they could do this on a smaller scale.
Okay.
We're just so big, and with our aging buildings, et cetera, that we needed to, outsource this, which we have. We've gotten this far, and we're just about ready to wrap it up.
Awesome.
We're already in the queue for the project grant
Okay.
for this year. But we have to have this on file in order to fully qualify. They know that we're just at the end of our process, and we have our projects lined up
Okay.
for the project grant, and we're pretty excited to move on.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate all the work all of you have done on it. It's great. Look forward to the reading.
Oh, yes. Great.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we know that we,
Thank you very much.
yeah,
Coming down.
we know that we, somewhat inconvenience folks and we show up because we need to be let into buildings and let around and all that stuff. So we always appreciate the efforts that you guys make to enable us to do what we're supposed to do.
It's a nice department
appreciate
of
it.
Public Works people letting us into buildings.
Yeah.
Comfort
Thank
stations.
you.
Feelings mutual. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Dismissed. You guys carry on.
We're carrying on.
The next item is old business. And this is just an opportunity for people to kind of feedback on how Disability Awareness Day 2019 went. And it goes without saying that we certainly want to thank Lisa very much for the coordination of this project, for this day. It was really well attended this year. So I wanted to know, Lisa, if you had any other observations that you
Any
wanted to make.
feedback from from some of the people that were, the vendors that were there, that they wanted to see different or?
No.
No?
No, just positive responses when I
Okay.
thanked them all for coming.
All right.
Yeah,
I think it was a great event.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing that.
definitely a lot more people attended than last
Last
year,
year,
which is good.
yes, that really did. And not having it at the same day as the, what was it, Holy Names?
Do you want to announce the date for next year,
Yeah, I think
Dennis?
we had already talked about that too.
Yeah,
right?
go ahead.
Is it September 26th,
Yep,
2020?
Yes.
September
Excellent.
26th,
All right.
2020, same place. I have a couple of more vendor ideas too.
All right. So we can just email you if we have any other thoughts or ideas, just email it to you.
Yeah.
As you're out meeting and working on it. Okay.
Okay, the next item is new business. We're going to hear on December 12th from Diamond Regional Vocational Technical High School. 251 Restaurant has a program called the Purple Table Designation, which benefits persons with disabilities. They're going to be, Maria Torres will be coming with Bristol Elder Services to talk about what that designation means, how it's implemented, and just kind of give us a rundown of that. And that will be next month on December 12th. Is there any other new business items? No. Okay, once again, I want to thank everybody. I know that this was rather lengthy, but I think it was necessary, and I think it was necessary for all of us as a commission to hear exactly what the transition plan was all about. So thank you for all your patience. And do I hear a motion to adjourn? Do
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? We're adjourned.
Thank you, Pam.